Good morning, ILCA members. I'm Scott Grams. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association, and welcome to our webinar, Benchmarking the Landscape Industry in 2022. Where do you stand? This webinar has been organized and provided by the ILCA Membership Committee. It is being recorded and should be posted to the members-only section of the ILCA website next week, and you'll receive notification when it has been posted. In the scope of my duties at the ILCA, I speak to enough owners and managers to know that running or managing a landscape business can be very isolating. Yes, you're surrounded by your employees. The phone never stops ringing, but are you running your business as effectively and efficiently as you think you are? You gather a room full of contractors and you ask them about their year, and it turns into a game of Texas Hold'em. Are people telling the truth? Are they bluffing? Are they sitting on aces? Are they sitting on twos? Who knows? Sometimes we don't even know ourselves. Prior to the saturation of business management systems, the question of how was your year resulted in answers that range from truth to a lie to a blind guess. And the data collection and sharing that business management systems provide is all true. It has to be. As one contractor put it, there's no dirty water in the river. ILCA took the steps about 6 months ago to reach out to Chris Poggi with Aspire. They produce an annual benchmarking report for their clients. This is an anonymous but unvarnished look at how the landscape industry is doing at any given time. It had an added benefit that surveys from ILCA or NALP or Lawn and Landscape Magazine cannot provide. It's all based on real data. We asked if Aspire could bring this report to life for our members. Chris connected us with Bryan Mours, who's formerly the Vice President of Client Experience for Aspire. And Bryan has worked in this industry for over 40 years. And since retiring from Aspire this past year, he's now consulting. Bryan's going to walk us through some of the key findings in the 2022 benchmarking report. He's going to discuss how to read and interpret the data. And finally, he's going to offer some perspective on how this data can be used to make changes that help insulate your business from a very uncertain road ahead. We don't know if belts in 2023 are going to tighten or loosen or stay the same, but we're hoping that you're going to be prepared. Your video is turned off and you're going to be on mute for the entire duration of the webinar. You may ask questions via the chat, and at the end, we will save time to answer those questions, and that will be done by Chris. On behalf of the ILCA and the ILCA Membership Committee, thank you all for being here this morning. We hope this webinar helps you feel a bit more connected and helps shine some light in the darkness. And with that, I turn it over to Bryan Mours. Bryan?
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you inviting me to go through our benchmark study with your organization. It's a privilege to be here, and again, hopefully this will shed some light on some of the findings that we that came about through our study in this report we do for Aspire clients. So let's move into the agenda and what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start by talking about the benchmark report. We're going to start kind of at the bottom and talk about things like net profit. We're going to talk about how that net profit is derived and how we can improve upon that net profit, because ultimately we're all looking to improve our bottom line in our company. And so we did this benchmark report, and really it was, as Scott mentioned, real data, right? At Aspire, we have over 500 clients who use our system, whose data is housed in our system, who agreed to participate in this benchmarking report and let us utilize their data so that we could produce some pretty solid results as a part of this report. And we'll talk about some stuff that we're going to get into, some very high level stuff. We're not going to get into a lot of the details on this because obviously a webinar is only 45 minutes to an hour long, and there's a lot in this report that could probably take a half day to go through. So again, we'll discuss a lot of the high level stuff. We'll also talk about a few of the details, right? How you can start today to be preparing yourself for kind of what's going on in the in the economy today by looking at different KPIs at your company. Our second bullet point here, and what some of those metrics are and how you can be keeping an eye on those things. Again, technology is a great source to be able to collect that data so that you can, right, understand those metrics and hold people accountable. And then we're going to move into production, right? This is all a part of capturing that data, and then of course estimating. So kind of taking a backwards walk through this workflow, starting at this idea of net profit. So with that, we're going to go to one of the things that we looked at in here was that double-digit net profits are possible. Oops, this thing wants to keep walking on its own. So in our study, we found that the mean, right, the center point where most of the companies across the country were reporting their net profit was in that 6% range. We did have companies in excess of 20% in the report. However, the mean was 6%. Now, good, bad, or otherwise, when I look back, if any of you used to look at the crystal ball reports that ILCA used to do, the old organization, national organization, they used to report these types of findings as well. And again, good, bad, or otherwise, the mean was still at around 6 to 7%. So in 20 years, because these reports, the ones that I looked at were about from 20 years ago, we haven't really done a whole lot to move that net profit line. And so hopefully, again, the one nice thing about our benchmarking report is we not only looked at the results and were able to show you these different results like net profit, but we also describe in there, and we'll talk about it today, how you can move those net profits, how you can get into those double-digit net profits at your company. So let's look at again, all this starts at the P&L comparison. So 15% of the companies we looked at were our high profit companies. And if you look at this as just a kind of a standardized, very basic P&L, we looked at this as a revenue, and it showed that those high profit companies were running at a mean average of about 54%. Now, the lower profit companies, surprisingly, in the study showed that they were showing a gross margin of 57%. However, when you got down to the real money, down in that bottom line, those high profit companies were running at about 16% as an average, as opposed to those lower profit companies who were in the 4%. Now, there's a few things, right? It could be service mix that played into that, but the one big line that, right, you see here is this idea of admin costs, right? And we're going to look at a couple of these leverage points within the benchmarking report, and one of them being admin or FTEs in the admin costs within your organization, and how the higher profit companies were able to control these costs better in order to show that higher net profit. And of course, technology plays into that because with technology, you can create efficiencies, just like creating efficiencies out in the field with different mowers, with making sure that you have the right number of people and pieces of equipment on the property. The same holds true when you're looking at the FTEs or the people within your office. And so looking at this from the perspective of, right, this higher profit companies, right, they were able to manage those costs below the net profit, before the gross profit line, better than the lower profit companies. And so again, looking at the net profit by breakout, because we did break this out into different sections of the not only size of company, but also region of the country, right? And Illinois falls in here in the Northeast. Everything east of the Mississippi, we put into the Northeast. And so we saw net profits in the 22% range. Again, the center point or the mean was at 6%. And then, of course, we were seeing lows, unfortunately, below zero as far as net profits are concerned. The other thing that we showed was, or looked at was based upon service line, this idea of maintenance versus construction, right? And how those profits related, because we're going to talk a little bit more a little later in the webinar here about how maybe you can adjust the revenues you're generating by service line to increase those net profits. So this is all about, right, how we look at the data and how we can work to improve those net profits. So these, again, these numbers up here and these numbers right here are more nationwide. This one is broken out into the specific regions. So if you're a $12 to $25 million company, this is what we were seeing across the country as far as the numbers that people were showing as far as their net profits were concerned. So with that, let's talk about, right, how do we work to improve upon those net profits? And the one way we do that is look at, again, from a very high level perspective, those different leverages that can affect net profit, right? This idea of return on assets, right? Everyone thinks of equipment only as an asset, but people, as we all know, are a huge asset within our organization. And so our study in the webinar today, I'm only going to focus more on the overhead and the labor leverage, the labor leverage being the production, right? The people out in the field, the overhead leverage being more the account managers, the salespeople, production managers, the people that aren't related in that direct cost of your jobs, right? That are built into more of the overhead of those prices that you sell. And so we calculated these leverages based upon the data that we received from our clients, and we produced some of these again results here based upon net profit. So again, this is showing that in the companies that were showing in that mean range from 4 to 8% showed a overhead leverage of 2.1, a labor leverage of 3.56. The higher the leverage number, the greater the gross profit. Now, equipment leverage, the reason we're not going to talk about that today, because we had some skewed numbers in there from a few of our people that were presenting the data. And so you see one that's 6.95. Typically, you're not going to see equipment leverage over probably 4 to 4.5. And so again, we're just going to focus today on overhead leverage and labor leverage and how you can work to adjust those two things to improve those net profits. So you'll see in the 12 to 16%, right, the overhead leverage was probably the biggest increase. Labor leverage tended to stay about the same in the between 4% and 16%, but it was really in that overhead or those FTEs that were considered in the overhead that really made a big part in that net profit within these organizations. So keeping these in mind, so if we take a look at maybe how can I shift my net profit? How can I start working on getting into those double-digit net profits? And so we're going to look at this, and we're going to see that if I go and I apologize for this flipping. I'm not sure why it keeps moving to the next one. But anyways, if I start here in the right column, right? Let's say these were my starting points for my my leverage numbers, and I move those by a very small amount, right? Leverage is all about, right, using a very small amount of pressure to make a really big thing move, right? If I take a fulcrum and I move a rock, right, I'm creating leverage to move that rock, right? We want to move that number by doing a very little bit to increase something a lot bigger, right? So I looked at this and said, okay, let's change this by 0.15, right? So afterwards, so looking at a company that's doing $8 million, right? We started off with our average wage rate of $14. Our realized rate, which is the amount of money, revenue I generate for every hour of work I'm doing out there on the job. My payroll hours, of course, my direct labor costs, my material costs, the gross profit, and then, of course, my overhead and my net profit. If we move those by that 0.15, you'll see here, right, the things that change, right? My realized rate, of course, is going to change because now I'm producing more revenue with less hours, right? And we all know that labor is one of the biggest, problems in the industry is finding enough labor. How about if we can reduce the amount of hours we need, meaning we can reduce the amount of number of people we need out there to produce the same amount of revenue, right? So if I can adjust that by a very small amount, right, I can move that number to reduce the payroll hours, and then of course reduce the payroll cost, and then my material cost stays the same. My gross profit goes up because my costs are lower. And then, of course, my overhead goes down because I also changed my overhead leverage ratio. And so that goes down as well. So the difference, as you can see there in my net profit line down on the bottom, goes from roughly about that 6% that we talked about, that was kind of our mean, into up to about 11%. So I've increased my profitability at my company just by moving those leverage numbers a very small amount. And how do you do that, right? We're going to talk about that here in the next upcoming slides. So looking at profit by gross profit by service line, right? This is what we found in our study. And again, we didn't break this out by different regions of the country. We do have a few more slides that talk about the specific regions of the country, but this one we just did as a very general, right? What are the different gross profit numbers based upon these different divisions within a company? And the reason, again, yeah.
Can you pause just a moment? Do you think you can back up to the previous slide, and can we just talk about how
Sure.
leverages are calculated? And then also if we can discuss realized rate and what goes into that calculation as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
The ratio is nothing more than, right, if I take my direct labor cost and divide it into my my revenues, right? That's what I'm coming up with as far as a labor ratio, right? The other is the overhead, right? Again, taking my overhead dollars and dividing it into my revenue. It's really as simple as that, right? All you're trying to come up with is what is a dollar of revenue or dollar of labor costs, right, produce as far as the amount of revenue is concerned. That's how we come to those leverage ratios, right? It's a dollar, $2.80, right, of revenue for every dollar of direct labor costs. The other thing that, of course, Chris asked, what was the other question?
Realized rate.
Oh yeah, realized rate. Sorry, realized rate is actually a very it's your revenue. It's kind of a revenue per hour. People will argue that realized rate is revenue per hour. Some people will say no, it's realized rate. Again, it's a term that is not widely used in the industry, but it is. Frank Ross actually uses it in his book, Pricing in the Landscape Industry. He talks about realized rate. Realized rate is really taking the revenue, removing all of the costs from it, right? So I remove all of my material, not labor costs. I remove my material, subcontractor, all of my other costs that are besides labor and their markups. And then I divide that by my number of hours on a job. So if I have a job that has it has materials, it has labor costs, it has maybe some subcontract costs, it has markups on all of those to come up with the revenue number. I remove all of those things from that revenue, and then I divide it by the number of hours that I bid for that particular job. It is the reason it's probably not widely used in the industry is because it's a difficult number to understand, but it is a very reliable number. If I know that I need to, again, from a budgeting perspective, if I know that I need to be producing labor at, let's say, $40 per hour at a realized rate, that's what I want to focus my teams on, right? To say, okay, let's bid based upon a realized rate of $40 per hour. It's something that you can present to your teams to say, okay, we want to bid at $40 per hour and we want to produce at $40 per hour. Any movement in that, right, can really affect, right, again, that bottom line, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about hours here in a few slides and how those can be affected or how those are going to affect that bottom line in the proper estimating.
Thank you, Bryan.
You bet. So again, coming back to this, right, this is just showing the percentages, and then I'll just let it jump to the next one because we are about to move on here. Because what this shows is we wanted to show in this, and again, this is all in our benchmark report because we just didn't want to produce numbers and say, okay, here's the numbers, take a look at them, see how they compare to your company. We wanted to also give you some examples of maybe looking at this service mix. So if I have, again, the top area is looking at this idea of revenue in each of the areas. Now, understand that overhead leverage is different in different areas of your business, right? You may have more salespeople dedicated to selling extra work or construction work. You may have more office work that needs to be done. You might have a purchaser that's in that overhead leverage specific to the construction or the extra side of things, where maintenance tends to be a little bit less on the overhead leverage. And so again, you're looking at these two things, understanding that overhead leverage can be different in different divisions. So if I start with that top area, right, I'm showing here a net margin of 0.4 or 4%, and my extras here at 25.7%. Totally, right, what I'm showing here is a 5.4% net overall, right? That's what I come up with as far as my overall net. Now, if I change that mix, right, if I move $200,000 over here into the extras, I sell $800,000 worth of mowing, but $450,000 worth of extras, right? You'll see how things change, right? My gross profit, of course, is going to be different. My overhead leverage as it relates to that revenue, right, is going to be different from a cost perspective. Ultimately, I come down to producing a 9.5% net profit. And so understanding that there is a way to improve, right? What you're trying to do is, rather than maximize your gross margin within your specific division, you're trying to optimize it, right? How can we get the best out of each division? How are we going to generate the most net profit in each division, right? Should I be selling more mowing work, or should I really be selling more enhancement work, right? Those are the things that we wanted to show with this graph. The next thing that we want to get into and talk about here is this idea of the guesstimate, or the estimate, which is again why that labor leverage number can be so can be different within organizations, right? Part of it is not having an accurate cost of that labor when you're doing your estimating. So maybe I didn't update my average labor rate every year to what it is reflective of what I'm paying my people. Maybe I didn't calculate my burdens correctly. Maybe I only used a 9% burden in my labor when it should be more like a 15%, right? Those numbers, if you're not accurate with those numbers from a starting point, right, it's going to reflect in the price, what I'm selling to my clients. And then ultimately, right, now if I didn't price it correctly because I was under cost in my guesstimate, right, ultimately I'm going to lower that net profit. So it's important to keep those numbers up to date, very accurate, and as close, right? Because again, I realize burden can be a little bit of a tricky number to calculate, but try to have them as close as possible to what the real number is, so that when you're bidding things, right, you're capturing all of those costs correctly. And then of course, using your markups, you're getting the correct price for that particular job. The other one is obviously what we're showing here is the hours bid, right? Jobs that in that far left column, jobs that required 20% more hours than originally bid. You know, it's hard to believe that that percentage is that high, but it is. It's the numbers that we saw that people were missing as far as jobs that they were bidding. The one in the center, of course, is more where, right, getting closer to that. Okay, we bid 10 hours and it took us 10 hours, right? So 33 and 36, right, is where that number is. And then of course we do have some jobs that, right, were overbid, right, as far as the number of hours, which isn't a bad thing, because again, if I can produce it better, faster for my clients, right, it's gonna produce bigger numbers on my bottom line. And so again, the ones that we want to really focus on, right, because this is all ties into that overhead leverage, is the jobs that are requiring that 20% more hours, right? If I get more accurate with my estimating, and we'll talk about, again, things you need to really be focused on here in a few slides. If I bid more accurately, my price is going to be more accurate. I'm going to produce those numbers. I'm going to be providing my crews with the proper numbers out in the field, and then ultimately, right, I'm going to see a higher net profit. And then this shows, again, just looking at the different aspects of things, right, by different areas, my size of company, what my wage rate, and this does not include burden, just so that I know that would be a question, right? This is just a average wage rate, as, you know, basically what am I paying my people? And so this is looking at the different cohort sizes of companies. Again, in the Northeast here in Illinois, this is, again, taking all of the Northeast, right? It's not just Illinois, but looking at this as a average or a our average wage rate that we're using to calculate our pricing, looking at a realized rate, and then a labor leverage of 4.15. So in the Northeast, actually, it's pretty good, high, right? It's pretty good as far as what that labor leverage is. So in the Northeast, they're doing a good job of making sure that they're getting a high realized rate. For every hour of labor, right, I'm producing $58.23, as opposed to the Southwest, which is only producing $41.63 for every hour of labor that they're out there doing. So just wanted to kind of bring, again, hopefully bring to you some of these numbers as they relate to the size of your company, the mix, right, of work that you do, maintenance versus construction, and then of course show you again a little bit of where maybe you should look at your company to be with regards to where that wage rate is, what you should be targeting as far as a realized rate, and then of course your labor leverage. So stepping away from the benchmark, so how can you start working today on things you need to focus on? In Aspire, we have a number of different KPIs and metrics and reports, right? Because companies are constantly feeding data into their system. The great thing is, right, they can go in and they can look at that data every single day, right? Those KPIs looking at labor leverage and your equipment leverage and your overhead leverage, those aren't necessarily day-to-day things you want to be looking at. Those are more global when you're doing your budgeting, when you're doing your annual assessment of your company. Those are the key things. And you want to look at them kind of on a rolling basis, on a rolling 12-month. Any of you that have studied with Frank Ross and the rolling 12-month budget, right? Looking at those from a 12-month perspective, not a day-to-day. These are more the things that you want to start looking at on a day-to-day to move those leverages, right? Those are going to affect those leverages looking at it from a 12-month perspective, but it's things that production guys, account managers, people in the field can start looking at and focusing on a day-to-day basis in order to start moving the needle on those leverages, so that, again, you saw how dramatic they can change that net profit number in this report. That's what you want to focus things on. And so looking at job costing, when your jobs are complete, how well do we perform? My work under contract, account managers we did another study that was, we didn't publish any of the report on, but some of our highest, the account managers, some of the most profitable companies, their account managers were doing in excess of $2 million of work under, not only under contract, but enhancement work too. So anywhere between $2 and $2.5 million of work for an account manager that they were managing on an annual basis, right? That's when you're talking about moving that labor or that overhead leverage line, right? Think about how much more work can an account manager, or how much more work can they sell and manage, right? To, again, move that overhead number, which we saw move that net profit number. Actual versus estimated hours. Again, very difficult to do without technology, very easy to do as soon as the day's over. If I want to look at those hours the next day, how well did we perform on all those, on all the mowing jobs we did yesterday? We can see that, right, from a very immediate perspective. Gross margin by division, very important, right? Again, from a sales perspective, not really trying to maximize as far as sales, because we saw how if we look at our service mix and how maybe if we focus more on extras versus more mowing jobs, we can actually move that needle. And then again, revenue per hour, realized rate, depending upon how people look at that number. It is, again, there are companies, very profitable companies, that are focused on that number and that number solely because they believe labor, as we all know, is the biggest driver in our industry, right? We are a labor intensive industry, even though, construction can weigh a little bit heavier on the material side, but we are very labor intensive. And so realized rate just kind of takes this, takes the other things out of it and focuses you right down on labor. How is my labor doing to produce revenue at my company? So how do we do that, right? We do that through accurate time tracking, right? Making sure that all of your time is getting allocated to the right bucket. The other thing that can happen to move that labor leverage line is time is not being allocated to the right thing, right? Guys are out in the shop, they're doing a safety training, but all of that time is going to the jobs during the day, when it should rather be in a bucket for indirect time, right? Making sure that, right, they're accurate in their clocking in and clocking out of these jobs, so that you know for a fact, right, whether or not you're profitable or whether or not you're hitting your gross margins on those jobs because you have accurate hours, right? So making sure you're getting accurate time tracking, making sure those dollars are going in the right bucket. And then, of course, we talked about this before, right? Making sure when you're doing it from an estimate standpoint, making sure your labor rates are matching, right? Your average rate, your bidding is your average rate you're paying your employees. The next area that, of course, we focus on is the idea of the Wild West of purchasing, right? And though this doesn't relate to any of our leverages, I think it's important to discuss that, again, in our industry, the purchasing has become a again, a little bit of a Wild West, right? Everyone gets a credit card. You get a credit card. You get a credit card. And people just go out and buy what they need to buy for their jobs. Just buy whatever you need, get the job done. Well, that's eating into those net profits, right? If we're just out there playing the Wild West of purchasing, we're probably not making the money we need to make. When we instituted, the landscape company I was last at, when we instituted the ERP system that we used there, one of the big areas that we found a lot of money that we were losing was in this area of purchasing and managing our inventory. That's kind of the next slide. But we were allowing people to just go out and buy willy-nilly. It had nothing to do with what we estimated. It's just get the job done, go buy what you need. Well, we went back to, okay, we have to manage this better by only purchasing what we estimated. And if there's other things that are necessary, we said, okay, that requires a change order, that we're going to have to go back to the client and ask for more money. So again, I know that's a slippery slope when people go, well, I can't go back to my client and ask for more money. I thought the same thing, and I was wrong. We can go back to our clients and ask for more money, provided we're doing the job right the first time and providing them with a good, clear estimate up front. They don't mind paying a little bit more if you have to go back to them for more money. I mentioned inventory control, right, being another area of material where it's difficult or where you're seeing money kind of going out the window. We all have probably inventory that disappears, unfortunately, inventory that is damaged. We all wanted to have a nursery in our yard to keep plants. However, I don't know why keeping dead plants is a good thing, because 9 times out of 10 companies have a hard time keeping them alive when they're in their yard. And so inventory control is a very important part of, again, understanding how you can manage your business. We did our inventory very much more on a lean management, where we did our material needs based upon when exactly we needed those materials. We kept very little in inventory at our place because we had a good relationship with our vendors and they would deliver product as needed. And so very important aspect of things. I did a webinar with Go Materials that also talked about this idea of material inventory control. And it's very important to understand kind of what you have in inventory, how you're managing that inventory, doing a regular count on that inventory, and making sure, again, your cost is accurate, right? Because again, if you're bidding those materials at a lower cost than what you're actually paying for them, and we all know that material market is very volatile today with petroleum prices and all these different things going all over the place. So making sure those costs within your catalog that you're using to estimate your jobs is accurate. Overtime or no overtime. This is a big discussion that or argument I have with a lot of people. And where does overtime belong? And we'll talk a little bit about what belongs above the line. Depending upon, again, I was always under the teachings that overtime belonged below the gross margin line. It's a place, again, that where the costs do come into account, but they come into account more as an indirect than they do as a direct cost. And again, I've had this, I've had the argument with a lot of people. The key to this slide is knowing when you can afford overtime and when you shouldn't be putting in overtime, right? You should be gauging that based upon your workload, right? And understanding how you can adjust that overtime to make sure that you're not going over your budget, right? You're not blowing your budget out of the water. We used to go out to the yard and go, okay, everyone's back at 5 o'clock now. We're only doing 2 hours of overtime per day that, you know, during this period, right? And we would actually go out on every Monday and talk to the crews about what we were going to allow as far as additional overtime. And I realize when workload jumps up, you may want to bump that. But again, you got to watch your budget. Are you budgeting for it? Did you bid it right so that you can afford that overtime? Knowing your margins. This is an estimate screen, right? So estimates, letting your account managers in on what they should be selling as far as gross margins are concerned. This is very important because, right, if they're not selling at proper gross margins, if your pricing model is set properly to recover your overhead, indirect equipment, and overhead properly, right? If you're selling to those margins and you're producing to those same margins, you're going to be profitable, right? And so make sure you share that, right? Make sure people understand why they should be selling to these numbers and the importance of selling to these numbers. So not only know your margins, but share those margins with everyone at your organization, especially those managers that are so important in running your business. Use production factors. Now I'm going back again through the workflow. I'm going into the estimating side of things, right? Use production factors. The green thumb method doesn't work anymore, right? There's so many tools out there that you can use to create takeoffs for your properties that then use production factors. If you don't know what your production factors are, take a stopwatch, go out, time the crew. That's what I did. Find out how long it takes a 48-inch mower to cut an acre of property. Find out how long it takes a guy to string trim 100 feet of fence line, right? Whatever it might be, find those production factors. What it helps in doing is scalability. It also is back to that hours accuracy. The reason we go over on hours is because we didn't use production factors, because we used the green thumb method and we said, okay, now we have to go over on hours. It's going to take us 2 hours, more hours than what they bid for this job every week. Well, at the end of the day, right, that's 2 hours times X, which is going to bring that net profit down. And it's going to bring your margins down, right? Because you're really underbidding these jobs. So my advice is to use the tools that are available with kits, assemblies, and takeoffs, right? Those takeoffs can produce accurate hours or more accurate hours than the green thumb method. And trust me, I used the green thumb method for years, and it wasn't extremely accurate, but it was, I like to think I was fairly close on some of those jobs. So last but not least, right, what to include in estimates to hold people accountable. It's my opinion that you want to be, in order to be able to have your people be held accountable, you need to you need to only include what they're in control of. My opinion, it should be labor, materials, your subcontractors, maybe some other costs like dump fees, permit fees, those types of things. And then of course, equipment, but only from a rental equipment perspective. If I don't put things that are in control for production people to be able to produce that they're in control of, right? If you're trying to add a lot of odds and ends into that gross margin line, it's going to be very discouraging, and they won't feel like they can be held accountable for those numbers. So you want to make sure labor is the big one, right? A lot of people just focus on labor. We want you to, a lot of the biggest companies in the country do that. They say, all we want you to do is focus on labor. You hit these labor numbers and these realized rates, and you're golden, right? If you don't, right, we're going to have to talk about how we can hit those numbers. And so accountability is very, very important in this. And we want to be able to pay our people more, right? Back to that whole idea of our leverages, right? And if I can increase the amount of revenue a person can sell to, right, under book, right? I want to also pay them better, because if they can go from selling $1 million a year to selling $2 million a year, they should go from being paid $60,000 a year to being paid $120,000 a year, right? The idea that we shouldn't be paying our account managers over $100,000 a year is it's old news, right? We should be paying people that, but they have to produce, and we have to hold them accountable. But we hold them accountable through good numbers, through solid numbers that we can show them. We can have them produce, we can have them estimate and produce, and that way we can pay them better. So again, accountability, very, very important. In the same holds true, right? Again, for anyone within the office that can do their job more effectively and more efficiently. So just keeping that in mind is very important. So in summary, I know I've probably ran long, right? This whole idea of double-digit net profits, right? They are possible. You can get to double-digit net profits. We did it at the company I was at by implementing a software and understanding where we needed to grow and improve. That's very, very important. Companies are afraid to spend money on training and technology. They think it's a waste of money. It's not. It's a huge, huge benefit. We are in a technology age. The landscape industry needs to get there. And so people think it's just a huge expense. It's not. It really drives that net profit line. And like I said, the company I was at was proof of it for me. And that's how I got into software, because I really, really understood how important software was for our industry and how it could help companies succeed. The profits, right, they're driven by investing in those areas, right, of leverage, labor, overhead, equipment, as we mentioned, technology. Maximizing profits relies on executing the core KPIs, right, those bigger leverage numbers. But right, how are those driven? Those are driven off of all those production and estimating things we talked about in those later slides. And then high profit firms, right, employ fewer FTEs than low profit ones. We saw that on one of the very first slides, right, showing how that overhead area, which is where our FTEs are in for, account managers, production managers, admin people, right, they can produce more with less people. And that's very important to understand. That's how they're driving their profit. We mentioned maximizing productivity through training and technology, and then paying attention to the revenue service mix, right? If I do have a higher leverage, overhead leverage in a particular division or service line area of my company, I should be focused on selling to that area, right? Because we can be more profitable in that area. And so work on optimizing that total gross profit versus maximizing. So that is my webinar. I do, again, greatly appreciate everyone that came and spent an hour with me today. And Chris, I'll open it up to you. Are there any questions?
We do. We have a couple questions here. One is from Jessica Rydell. Jessica was asking, how are people keeping employees and having a labor rate of $13.45? I think it was $13.76 on a slide. My lowest experience and cheapest employee is starting at 17 per hour. So if you'd like to answer that.
Great question. I know that it is an average wage rate, and you're right. Some areas of the country do have to pay more. Now, remember, that is taking into account all areas in the Northeast, and there's some areas that are paying less of a labor rate than maybe people in the Chicago or Illinois area, right? And so again, I know it's hard to surmise or say, okay, I can't afford to pay that, right? You shouldn't, right? You should understand what your market is bearing, right? Because you need to get those key employees. The key to it is if you're going to pay 17, don't pay 17, pay $20 an hour, but maximize their productivity, right? Show them how they can be better at their jobs, train them, teach them on technology. Those are the key things. And again, $17 an hour, right? How about if you can afford to pay $25 an hour because you're maximizing their productivity? Now you really have something. Now you have, right, people coming to knock on your door to be hired by you, right? Those are the keys in that. I totally agree with you, right? That numbers seem low, but those are the numbers we got out of the system, and it was a bit surprising to us as well. Maybe some of it was old data and people weren't updating their costs as well, which, again, unfortunately, when you do use technology, some people put in a cost for labor 8 years ago when they first implemented the software. 8 years later, they're still using the same costs. Shame on them.
And Bryan, just for clarity, can you share the timeline that this data was collected from?
It was collected in kind of the full year of 2020. It was actually between 2020 in the fall through 2021 in the fall. And so it was a year's worth of data that we looked at so that we could take into account all of the months, right? Up north here, right, we have winter, so we wanted to make sure we took into account the snow belt up here. And so again, we took the data from starting in, I think it was October of 2020 through September of 2021.
Thank you. Let's see, we have Todd, I think, or T. Doring. Is there more data on the realized rate by division or geography?
I believe in the benchmark report, we may have a few more items that do talk about the realized rate. I don't have it right here to be able to pull up for you, but would be happy to share that with Scott so that he can share it out to you guys.
And let's see if we have any other questions here. I think I have hit them all.
Chris, I had a question.
Sure.
I noticed you didn't bring up the W word, which is weather. Managing some of these costs, I think in a McDonald's would be challenging, let alone one that has weather delays. And I think one of the major differences between even 20 and 21, on top of the increases in prices, inflation, et cetera, was the lost productivity in the spring due to weather events. How do you take weather into account when trying to establish these rates?
Yeah, great question. Where weather tends to skew those numbers a bit is in the fact that you tend to see kind of a shift into a little bit of overtime because, right, what happens when we get weather events, we have to then typically work more overtime in a given period of time. And again, based upon the way we teach Aspire, overtime becomes an indirect cost. And so it plays into that cost where it raises those, it raises that labor, or it lowers that labor leverage because I have more cost than associated to my revenue. So we probably saw a decrease. You're going to see a decrease in that labor leverage number because your costs are going up because of that overtime factor that's coming into play. And you're right, weather is one of those four nasty 6-letter words that we like, snow. We don't like to use, but any other questions, Chris?
I'm going to ask one here.
Sure.
So we talked about contracts, and when we're looking at that wide range of actual hours to estimated hours. So let's talk through what are some of the considerations when you're going through the renewal process, or even during the season when you're looking at your contract and seeing that the contract might have been underestimated. What are some tools that folks can utilize and should take into account?
Yeah, the tough part for maintenance, as we all know, is right, once it's bid, it's bid. It's not like construction and going back for a change order, right? It's and even with things like fuel costs, everyone started putting on a fuel surcharge. Looking at and understanding some of those things. But I think what's it again, back to this idea of setting yourself up for success, right? Success happens by planning. And again, planning begins at that very first stage, right? Are my costs accurate? Am I using production rates? Am I looking at, right, even so much as, is it the right crew and the right equipment leverage that we didn't talk about, right? Typically, a lot of companies have too much equipment and their leverage is low because they have too much equipment for the amount of work they're doing, or they have the wrong equipment for the work they're performing. And so there's other factors that play into that, but it's really about making sure you're getting that first stage of it, right? That planning stage in place, right? That's going to set yourself up for success. And again, takeoffs, I can't tell you how many companies go takeoffs. What's a takeoff? That is very, very important in this stage. It's tough to do after the fact. It's tough to say, go back to a customer and say, hey, I'm going to I need to increase your price. But when it comes time to renew, don't be afraid to adjust, right? If you did underbid, you have to adjust. If a company hasn't had a price increase in years, you have to increase those prices. That's been a difficult for people this year, but I think people are understanding of price increases because they're seeing it all over the place. And so again, I'm not saying take the opportunity to increase your prices just because. I'm saying analyze your work, look at how you performed on those jobs, and then make the appropriate changes, whether it be in pricing, costs, or just increasing your net profit.
All right, and it looks like it is the top of the hour. Bryan, do you have an extra 10 minutes if we'd like to stay on for additional questions here?
I actually have a hard stop here at 10, so I apologize. Okay. I did kind of cut myself tight, but happy to, if people want to send questions to Scott, I'm happy to have Scott forward those along to me and then respond. I'll also be happy to jump on a phone call if anyone needs me to jump on a phone call and just to chat about things. I love talking to people in our industry. I've been in this a long time.
Great.
Yeah, and also to mention, Bryan is going to be doing an educational workshop at the iLandscape show this year as well. So that's going to be good news. We'll have Bryan back to go into a little deeper depth on some of these issues. But yeah, if anybody does have any questions, they can send them to me I'll put my email in the chat, and then I can pass them around to Bryan and to Chris, and we can get some answers for you.
All right,
And thank you, Bryan. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that's a lot to go into over a webinar. I really appreciate the additional time you gave us today, and we'll be seeing you at iLandscape in February.
You bet. Looking forward to it. Thank you all. Take care now.
Thank you.